dedicated to the holy memory of my dear mother, all the martyrs of World War II, in particular the ones that did not survive the gas chambers, and all that perished in World War II. In the early 1920s, my parents got married in Krakow and fulfilled their lifetime dreams by making Aliyah to what then was Palestine. My father, Eli Meir Geyer, was one of 4 sons and a sister. He was born in a small town in Galicia. My mother was born in Nemyriv, also in Galicia. She was one of 4 girls and was of the family name Schall. After some hard work and determination, my dear parents became the proud owners of a small corner ice cream parlor or cafe maybe, situated in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that lifetime dream of my parents and their achievement was short-lived. It became more and more obvious that my father had a digestive problem, and by seeing several doctors who have concluded that the extreme difference in the climate between the European climate and the climate in Israel, the extreme heat, was causing the constant stomach upset, and had concluded that the dream had to stop. They had to leave Israel because of my father's health. And so the dream of my parents came to an end. They had to leave Palestine, and the dream was over. They returned to Krakow, Poland, and after a while, my mother and her 3 sisters got together to open a wig-making shop. These custom-made wigs, which by the way were made by hand, each individual thread or hair was made by hand. These were bought and worn by religious women. The shop became successful, and by working together, all 4 sisters, which consisted of my mother, Ethel, then came Sheva, then came Bella, and then came Raja. In that sequence, married a couple of years from each other. My mother, the wig-making trade came to the sisters through the apprenticeship of Sheva, who as a young woman learned the trade from a lady whose name escapes me, but later on in life I had the privilege of meeting her in Vienna, Austria, some years later. In the 1920s, mid-1920s, my aunt Sheva married a man by the name Yehiel Brihant, one of 4 sons, and who was what we would call nowadays a builder, although in those days he was presumed to be an engineer. I do not know if he had any degrees, because it was very hard for a Jewish man to get a degree in a university. But I do know that he was a successful builder, and later on in my memoirs I will tell the story as to how successful he was. At the very same time, Bella met a man by the name Moshe Shpigler and got married to him as well. Raja, who was the youngest of the sisters, had a speech impairment and got married to a very religious person, and after about a year he left her, and she had a little girl from him named Adusha. In 1925 in Krakow, my mother Etta Geyer bore a child, a boy who was named Moshe, and from all the descriptions that I have, he passed away after 6 weeks on what we now know as crypt death. In 1926, my parents, Maya and Etka Geyer, moved to Chorzow, known as Królewska Huta, or in German, Königshütte, where they opened a small store in ready-to-wear menswear and boyswear. And by 1927, I showed up on the scene, and I was named Avram Yitzchak Geyer. I vividly remember our first apartment, where I was approximately 4 years old or thereabouts. It was a 2nd-story, 2-room apartment. In the first room there was a stove, kitchen-like, and dining area. The second room was divided by a moving curtain on a rope, and it was a bedroom and storage room. It was located on Czartkow Maya, which is the name of the street, and originally it is a Polish holiday, the 3rd of May. The complex in which this apartment was located was known as Górecki complex. Górecki was the front of that complex, and it was a drugstore, and I think it was the owner who was called Górecki. Chorzow was a steel foundry city surrounded by coal mines. I was told by my mother that at the age of 4 I developed a whooping cough, and as a result, or at least as a consequence of the whooping cough, I wound up with what now is known as an asthmatic condition. Whether or not it was the consequence of the whooping cough, I really now believe it was the environment, the pollution that existed from all these fumes that came out of the refineries, that I wound up being an asthmatic, and my poor mother had to countless nights carry me around on her shoulders and on her arms to finally get me to fall asleep. due to my father's idea of giving people some of our ready-to-wear clothes, and they in turn used to go around to working couples and give them at a discount ready-to-wear clothing. Our business expanded a lot faster than in previous years, and therefore it became necessary to enlarge the facilities and the accommodations. So my parents moved on the same street, Trzeciego Maja, to the corner of Kościelna and Trzeciego Maja, which was comprised of 3 large display windows on Trzeciego Maja and 3 on Kościelna. 2 entrances, one from Kościelna and one from Trzeciego Maja. At the same time, they decided to move into more comfortable living quarters, and also because it was across the street from the store, also on the corner of Kościelna and Trzeciego Maja, but on the opposite side of Kościelna. These accommodations were much more modern and larger. It consisted of 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a good-sized kitchen, what was considered then a modern bathroom in the apartment, including a bathtub which had gas-fired hot water, which was then considered modern. The move of both the store and our living quarters occurred approximately in 1930. With this came another innovation. My little brother, may he rest in peace, Chaskel. Chaskel was a beautiful child. He was blonde and one of those pleasant, quiet children. Everything seemed to work out well, not only with the family, but business-wise as well. The time now is approximately the early 30s, and Germany was starved for ready-to-made wear as well as for food, because now Hitler was about to turn everything into war machinery, and the people who lived only 4 kilometers the other side of the border, which was Boyton, or in Polish Bytom, had a streetcar that ran right across from Chorzow to Boyton, with a stop at the border, which was just a formality, and people used to come to our store with all torn clothing, dump it, and buy new clothes from my parents, and it became something that really turned into a huge business. My parents found it necessary not only to have a staff of about a dozen salespeople, they also brought in a cousin of my mother's, Maya, and eventually a cousin of my father's, Kiva. Both of these young men have helped in the business. Maya in particular was a very learned person and was doing the bookkeeping and the accounting for my parents. My mother, who was very much involved in running of the business, has had to have not only someone to look after the household, a Polish girl named Janina, but now, since I became sort of a problem, running around in the long corridor in the apartment, wanting to go out and pray with others. My mother found it necessary to hire a young woman, which we would consider nowadays as a governess, to keep track of me and at the same time keep an eye on the baby, which was Chaskel. The young woman that was hired to take care of the kids was a German descendant, or her parents were German actually, but in 1918 the plebiscite put Chorzow into Polish hands, yet the population was maybe 40% German, and therefore Greta, the name of the governess, or the woman that was taking care of the children, was German. And probably because of her German speaking to me and most of the time to my parents, I became more acquainted with German than with Polish. In fact, when time came for me to enter grade 1, I had difficulties because I didn't speak very well Polish and had to learn while going to school the language of the country. By now, being prosperous and busy, having 2 little boys, my parents slowly have overcome their tragedies, such as leaving Eretz and losing their firstborn, Moshe, at 6 weeks. They now have started to enjoy their life, but as life is, it struck again. This time the tragedy was enormous. I recall one day Janina told my mother that Chaskel was feverish and wouldn't eat because she was in charge of the baby, while I was the big boy. And I was taken to Katowice, which was some 10-12 kilometers from Chorzow, where my aunt Bella Shpigler and Moshe Shpigler had a similar store to my parents, ready to wear, and had an apartment above the store. And I was told that because the sickness is contagious, I would have to stay with my aunt Bella until Chaskel got better. Weeks went by, and I have not seen my parents. And I was told by my aunt Bella that things are pretty difficult, that my little brother had diphtheria, which is an infection of the throat, and that my parents are so preoccupied with that they're unable to come to see me, although it was only 15-20 minute ride by streetcar. But they were so busy making all things possible to cure my little brother, including bringing in from Vienna, which in those days that was considered an impossibility. They brought in a doctor who specialized in this sickness, and I was told later, in our large room, that was actually a spare room in the apartment that we lived on, a table was made up and a nurse was brought in, and the doctor performed some operation which I was then explained was some tubing inserted into my little brother's throat to enable air to get into the lungs because of the swelling of the throat, and he couldn't breathe at that stage. In any event, it took about 6 weeks, and then I was told I have no longer a brother. Even now, that many years later, I can't even imagine this type of destruction that befell my poor mother and our whole family. Now I became the center of life. My mother would dedicate any minute she had from her daily chores, being a wife, being a housewife, being a main pin in the business. She would dedicate that time to her only eye in her head. She called me the only eye she has left. And any occasion she had, she would take me to places like Krynica, Bystra. All these places were at that time considered very well-known resort places, such as Zakopane and other places that are even today famous. And she would take me on those vacations all the time. My father, at one point, I think I was just about to enter school, decided that he wants to show me off to his parents. And so he took a few days to take me by train to a place called Lutowiska, which was in Galicia, south of Lwow, which was a big city. And the only accommodations there were horse and buggy, and you got off the railroad train called Ostriki Dolne. You traveled by horse and buggy for about 2.5 hours to Lutowiska. Lutowiska was a very small town, almost like a village, consisted of a square, and here and there was a house or a farm, but the population couldn't have been more than a few hundred people. My grandparents had a tiny little store in the front of their home, which was also a very small house consisting of maybe 3 or 4 rooms, and the front of it was that store, which was, if I remember right, wheat and corn in large sacks, and it was a scale hanging on a chain, and people came and bought a kilo of this or a kilo of that, and that was the whole enterprise. There was also, just above the square on the way, on the main street, a bit of a guest house, a beer hall, miniature type as we know it today. And the one thing that impressed me and still remember was a billiard table, and that was the center of entertainment for not just the villagers, but farmers used to come from around and play billiards or have a beer. That guest house was owned by my Aunt Peggy and her husband, whose name I don't remember, and I had really been babied from asking me what I would like to do and playing billiards. At that age I really didn't know what I wanted, and especially since I was away from my mother, I used to complain that I want to go home, yet my grandparents tried everything possible, and Fega and her husband tried very hard to accommodate me, and they went as far as they got a pony horse from one of the villagers and put me on it and led me around, but I still was very, very much complaining about I want to go home. After leaving my grandparents, Auntie Fega and her husband, on the way back, my father decided that we will stop at his brother. His brother's name was Kiva Geyer, who was living in a small village, maybe an hour and a half away from Lutowiska. I remember Uncle Kiva because of his stature. He was a very tall man. The wife and two kids whose names I don't remember. He was making a living of having a sawmill, which consisted of a outside large saw on a built-up bench, and the villagers used to come with cut whole trees with no branches on them, and they would run them through that big saw on that bench and make rough-looking boards, long, heavy boards, which I assume were basically lumber to build houses. We stayed there over a couple of days and went on the way home. On the way home, I learned that I have another uncle, Uncle Anshel, whom I've never met, but he was living in a town which was considered a city of stature because it was in the oil patch of Poland. It was known as Drochowicz. I have never met him or his family. I also found out later that I had an aunt, Chaya, which unfortunately I never met, and she lived with her family a little bit north of Galicia. It was known in Polish as Polesie. Fortunately, I have never met all these people. My mother also showed me off in her hometown of Nemyriv, which was close to Ravaruska. And I still recall her tall, very tall cousin Yosala and his family. Although I don't recall their name, there was a little girl about my age, and all of these people have perished in the Holocaust. I still remember a couple of things that I have observed and learned in Nemyriv. The first one is that not everyone had electricity, and in a village like Nemyriv, they had none. They had lighting by oil lamps and candles, and for their dairy products, they had a trapdoor in the floor, went down on a ladder to about a basement level or even deeper, and kept their dairy products there instead of we in Chorzow would have ice boxes. The other incident that is stuck in my mind is probably because they used candles and oil lamps. One morning I was woken up by a lot of bell noises and a lot of commotion. And when I went out through the door, there was already a cousin and some other people watching a horse-drawn barrel-like wagon with two men with helmets on, and what I understood, that was the fire department. Two horses pulling a barrel-like wagon with some hoses attached. I have not seen the fire department in action, but I saw them run by on one of the streets down the road to where probably the fire was going on. The basic school that I attended to in Chorzow was a Jewish school, mainly because all the pupils were Jewish, and as far as I know, the teachers were Jewish. The other thing that made it Jewish is the fact that it was in the building that consisted on the main floor of a sort of a religious Hasidic shtibel, and the other half of that main floor was where kosher chicken slaughterhouse. And that wasn't really a slaughterhouse. All it was is a place where the shochet would kill the chicken and let it drain, and then with the feathers and all, the people would take it home to do the rest. So that was the main floor. The next two floors were classes, and the basic curriculum was Polish, geography, mathematics, and literature. The building was located on a street called Kazimierza, taken from the King of Poland, Casimir the Great. And right across the street from my school building stood an impressive building built in the style of German temples and synagogues that would be considered nowadays conservative, although women were separate, sitting on balconies above, with a choir on the third floor, and a bima that was very much progressive, so to speak. The rabbi and the cantors were always dressed in special kittles, with, and in some instances they wore top hats, and as well as some fancy kittles. And the whole synagogue and the conduct was very impressive to me. Unfortunately, I only have attended to it on Yom Tov and on other special occasions. In the late 1930s, the anti-Semitic inclinations of the Polish populations were getting more and more obvious. Kids going from school, from our school, were sometimes attacked by non-Jewish youth, boys, and as a matter of fact, I have instituted some sort of a resistance which consisted of having one of our boys singularly go past the place where they usually were waiting in doorways to catch a Jewish kid and hit him with a school case, or just simply by hitting him with a fist. We would send one of our boys past those places and waited till he was attacked, and then we would come along, 3 or 4 of us, and with not suitcases but briefcases, school cases, beat those guys so that they would get a lesson that there is some resistance. However, our parents believed that when you see anything like that, cross the street and go on the other side, which was the Galut mentality. There were other signs obvious of what the Polish population thought of their Jewish citizens. For example, on fences, on streets, there would be signs like Pred Shredami a Żydówki z nami, which simply means away with the Jews, but we'll keep the Jewish girls. And while this was so obvious, most of the Jewish population thought that what that is a temporary and something that will go away as well. At about that time, Adolf Hitler has very openly pronounced his view of what is to be done. In one of his many speeches, he made a statement, Ich werde sämtliche Juden in Europa ausrotten. I shall annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. And on one occasion, I recall turning to my mother when we were listening to this tirades of Hitler, and I said, Ma, can you see what's happening? In reply, my mother said, Dear son, this is over there. They have a dictatorship. We in Poland are a democratic country. There is nothing to fear here. That was only less than a year before Hitler marched into Poland. Shortly after I started school, my nanny, Greta, got married to a German who was a pilot in the German Air Force, and she moved to Berlin. In 1937 or 38, she visited her parents who lived in Chorzow, and she came to see me and my family. At that visit, she came up with a proposal which later on we realized was a terrific idea, however, was rejected outright. And the idea was that maybe because of what's going on and how everything is working out between Poland and Germany, threats and so on, she proposed that Mother lets me go with Greta to Germany for at least a few months until everything would calm down. However, my parents wouldn't hear about this, and therefore we later realized that she and most of the people in Germany realized what is next to happen. As I already stated, I attended day school, and most of the kids that I knew used to stay in a school on Kazimierza, which in the afternoon was converted into a Hebrew school. But because of my health and because my mother was overprotective about me not resting enough, I did not attend the afternoon Hebrew school. Instead, the same teacher, Kokoczynski was his name, used to come twice a week to our house and give me lessons in Hebrew. And simply because my mother was a staunch believer that one day Israel will exist, in those days they call it Palestine, and that one day I will need Hebrew to communicate and be associated with what her dream was at those days about home in Israel. I have not taken Hebrew as a religion or as a part of a religion, although I was taught some Chumash and prayer, but mainly Kokoczynski was teaching me the Hebrew language per se. I also had a few friends, one of which was Ernst Westreich, who lived about a block away from our house. There was a young fellow by the name Lemek Chapnik, a young fellow by the name Bogomolny, and surprise, there was two young ladies I knew. One of them was Rutka Ehrenwort, and the other one was Lilka Bornstein. All of those were approximately my age, which was about 10 years, and none of which survived the Holocaust. Sometimes in 1937, my parents took me for a visit to Krakow, to visit my aunt Sheva and her husband Schall, and during that visit they took me to what they nearly acquired, a large property on Aleja Slowackiego, which even now is a very high-class neighborhood. That was the first time in my life that I saw a 5-story building which contained an elevator. And I was so impressed because I was taken up and down with that elevator a couple of times because I insisted I needed to know how this works and how it felt. And till today I remember I tried to memorize, and still do remember, the name of the manufacturer of that elevator, which was Wertheimer. Obviously it sounds like a German name, and that's what probably it was. Shortly after that, sometimes in 1938, we got from the Polish government security risk expulsion, presumably in our money bracket that my parents have achieved according to the Urząd Skarbowy, and that's the finance ministry. We were too close to the border, and therefore we would have to leave Chorzow. And we did. My parents arranged to rent a apartment on Florianska 14, which was near Brama Florianska, which in Polish means the gate of Florian, and it's a historical site. As far as our business in Chorzow, it was taken over by the Shpiglers, my aunt and uncle, as a temporary measure. Before we left Chorzow, I was taken to the cemetery to say my goodbyes to my brother Chaskel. No one in our family could have imagined that that was the final time that we would see the caver of my brother. In the spring of 1939, my mother, myself, my aunt Sheva and Adusha went to Krynica, which was a summer resort, and we stayed in a kosher hotel known as the Four Roses. Krynica was well known for the mineral water, which supposedly was healing every ill, and there was also a bath, a mud bath called Borovina, and most of the people believed that was very healthy. At our vacation in Krynica, my mother thought it was about time that I got acquainted with some Jewish habits, such as a mikveh, which I have never seen before, and I was asked by my mother to attend with someone else, a guest from the hotel, that took me with him to participate in one of the steam baths, which I didn't particularly like, and I never took it since. However, it was an experience that I still remember. Towards the end of our vacation, the porter in the hotel was looking for either my mother or my aunt to reply to a telephone call that came from Krakow. After replying, my mother told me that uncle and my father are concerned we should immediately return to Krakow because of rumors of an impending war. And so we did, and got on the first available train back. To our new home on Florianska 14. We hardly unpacked. A day or two after returning, the first bombs fell on Krakow, and it was the first time that I have been taken to a basement, because everyone in the building, which was about a 3-story building, thought that that was the safest place to, and also because it was announced and ordered everyone should go down into a basement or a air shelter. My Aunt Bella and her 2 children, Chaim and Avram, by now escaped from Katowice and were now in Krakow. And my aunt was extremely worried because her husband Moshe was called to the military and had to report to his hometown where he was born in Wolbrom, approximately 40-50 kilometers north of Krakow. My father has been able to convince a taxi driver, and for a good fee, to take him and Auntie Bella to Wolbrom to see where Moshe was. That same night, when they returned from Wolbrom, they could not find Moshe. Obviously, with the military, they would not confirm or deny whether he was drafted or sent away. However, they returned and decided it was time to leave Krakow in a hurry. So early in the morning, mother, myself, my father, and Tibella and her two sons were at the railroad station looking for some transportations going east because that was the only possibility to escape the Germans who were advancing from the west. By noon, we were on a cattle car heading east towards possibly Tarnów, Rzeszów, or even Lwow. However, we got as far as Wieliczka, which is about 40 kilometers east of Krakow, when the Germans bombed the railroads and the train stopped and everyone took shelter. And that was the end of our travel by train. We walked a couple of kilometers and wound up in a village. We took some rest, and my father went into the village. After an hour or so, he returned with good news. He convinced one of the farmers to sell him a horse and a hay wagon, which had some straw at the bottom as well as some feed for that horse. We all got onto the wagon with a few possessions we had with us, and we headed east. We only stopped when the horse needed water or was fed, but we constantly were moving east, and so was a lot of other people, including the Polish military. And because the soldiers were among the civilians, or whether or not that made any difference, the German planes were shooting with machine guns onto the roadway. I recall one instance, the second day of our flight, my father saw planes flying by and returning towards us. He screamed, "Get off the wagon, get into the woods, get into the woods." And he disconnected the horse and grabbed Avram, the older of the boys, and I grabbed Chaim, the younger ones, and ran towards the forest, which was a couple of 100 feet away. However, I have sensed that it was a little hard on me to carry him, so I found a culvert with a concrete pipe in it, and I hit myself and Chaim into that culvert, and sure enough, after we got out, my parents from the forest and myself from the culvert, we found bullet holes on both sides of our wagon, and even the place where usually the horse would be attached to the wagon. After 3 or 4 days, we finally wound up in Czortkow, where my mother had a cousin, Hannah Schechter, who was married to the Czortkow Rabbi Steinberg. Rabbi Steinberg was also a major and the spiritual rabbi for all military in Poland. The evening of the day we arrived in Czortkow, the Polish military headquarters has sent a truck and 2 soldiers to evacuate Rabbi Meir Steinberg, because he was considered a military important officer. So Hannah and Meir Steinberg were gathering a few belongings and have begged us to join them on the truck, because 10 kilometers from Czortkow was the Romanian border, and the arrangement was made with Romania to allow that particular truck to pass and escape the Germans. Unfortunately, my mother and Auntie Bella would not go along with that idea, because first of all, Aunt Sheva and Uncle was in Krakow, and what even was more important, no one knew where Moshe Shpigler was, and therefore they couldn't leave the country thinking that in a few days things will normalize and somehow we will be together again. So the Steinbergs, Hannah, Meir, and Dusha, their daughter, a little girl, were driven away to Romania and eventually wound up in England. We remained in Czortkow, and in a few days after the Steinbergs departed, the Russians marched into Poland, occupying Czortkow, and half of Poland, the eastern half of Poland, was occupied by the Russians, and by agreement, the Germans, the agreement between Germany and Stalin made Poland now to be occupied by Germans and by the Russians. Our family, now consisting of my mother, my father, myself, Auntie Bella, her 2 boys, decided to move up north to Lwow. And a short time after, Uncle Moshe, who now was released from the Polish army because they never had a chance to even resist any of the occupation, so they disbanded the Polish army, and Uncle Moshe wound up in Lwow and joined his wife and the 2 boys. My parents and I have moved into a 2nd-story small apartment consisting of 2 rooms and a small kitchen, and the neighborhood in Lwow was known as Lichakov, which was a northern part of the city. I was enrolled into a public school known as the 88th Jewish School, which was down at the center of the city, and it took about 20 minutes by streetcars to get to it every day, but it started to feel like normal times, classroom and regular hours, and life became almost normal. The curriculum at the school was primary Yiddish, which I have just started to learn. It also required the knowledge of Ukrainian because Lwów was considered part of Greater Ukraine, and we also had to naturally learn Russian because the Russians consider that now part of Russia. Not only have we learned the Russian language, but the Russian propaganda and the political influence in the school was very great, and we've been actually brainwashed to the degree where I myself believe that this is the right way to live, that everyone is equal, and most of all, no antisemitism or any other discrimination would be tolerated. And among other political influences, there was a common standard that if a pupil was reasonably good, he would automatically become a pioneer. That happens to be with boys, which at that time was considered like we would now call Boy Scout. And so within a few months I have become a pioneer with a red tie with a chrome pin to hold it at the neck, and it had a very high philosophical inscription, which I thought was a terrific idea at the time, and it said, "Будь готов," which means be ready. My mother's interpretation of be ready was be ready for the life that you will go into. Others thought it meant be ready to defend your country. So all of this influenced my thinking that I finally am at the right place and the right philosophy of life, until one day when I learned that the slogan of "we are all equal" came to a test. A friend, a school friend, and myself decided that we were going to go to see a movie because it was highly recommended by the teachers and the pioneer leader, the scout leader, that we see the movie called Our Unbeatable Red Army Against Finland's Aggression. One afternoon we went downtown and stood in line to enter that particular movie to see this film. And as usual, there was a long lineup, and as we stood there, an elderly couple, presumably Jewish, because the lady wore a fur coat which sort of indicated well-to-do, and an older gentleman with her. And as they were passing the lineup, they kept looking back on the faces they just passed. Presumably, they were trying to see if there's any friends in the lineup. As they passed us, in front of us, maybe the second person in front of us or the third person in front of us, we heard distinctly in Russian somebody saying, "Damn Jews are trying to sneak in." And that was enough to really get me and my friend all boiled up. So as a consequence, I asked my friend, "Did you hear that?" And he replied, yes, and I'm going to take care of it. Now, he was better versed in Russian and knew the city better than me, because he was a local boy and I was just new in the city. So he says, you stay here, I'll be right back. Sure enough, after a few minutes, he returned. What I could tell right off the bat was two guys that were Russian undercover agent known as the NKVD, Narodny Komissar Vnutrny Sprav. And the reason I could tell that is because they had very elegant boots and fur hats on them and reasonably well dressed in civilian clothes. And that was a rarity at the time. However, as he came back into the lineup, he pointed at the two guys that made the remarks about the elderly couple. And the two Russian policemen, or undercover police, asked the two guys to step out of the lineup and come with them. And all four of them disappeared at the end of the lineup. After another half or three-quarters of an hour freezing outside in the lineup, we finally got into the foyer, and while my friend was getting the tickets at the cash register or the cash booth, I noticed in the far corner a couple of faces that I thought I knew, and my God, yes, those were the two undercover police standing with the two guys that in the front of us made those remarks about this Jewish couple, smoking cigarettes and having a good time, laughing. And at that time I realized that yes, we're all even, we're all equal. But some people are more equal than others. And that really caused me to think about the theory of all being equal. My father was providing the family with daily necessities of day-to-day living, and that included buying groceries and paying the rent. So he was trading on what was then called the Berja. That is more or less a exchange where people were selling gold and foreign currency for the same reason as with my father, in order to be able to sustain themselves. It would be considered nowadays a black market, but it was commonly known that Russians who had some old coins and wanted to obtain such thing as a dollar, an American dollar or a British pound, would come down there and very quietly and secrecy get to know one or two people and make those deals. One of those people was a Jewish officer, what they called a politruk, which comes from the word political. A political officer in the military who was more or less someone who taught the soldiers of the virtues of being a communist and being a soldier for the country. And that politruk, the Jewish officer, befriended my father and dealt with my father, and it went as far as even a couple of Friday evenings he came to visit us, and as a consequence he on the quiet told my father that in order to be eligible for different privileges such as medical, and even in some of those items that were hard to get or were not available to the public, it would be advisable if he applied to get what was known a passport with a number 11, which would make him a important person that would be essential for the well-being of the then city of Lwów. And in order to get this paragraph 11 passport, he would have to have some sort of a important position in the workforce or in some of the offices that were essential for the city of Lwów. So he provided my father with a komandierówka, which is a permit to do purchasing for a small factory on the outskirts of Lwów. My father didn't even know where it was or what it was, but he had a document stating that he is the purchasing agent for that little factory. It was a wood factory or plywood factory. I don't really know exactly, but it had something to do with wood, furniture or so. And with this certificate of being important to that factory, my father did obtain a paragraph 11 passport. In 1940, during the summer, the Soviet Union decided that all bieżańcy, which means all people who were not originally from that part of Poland, were considered refugees and would have to be resettled deep into Russia. Everyone that didn't have a document of any importance to the local government was shipped off, some to Siberia, some to Ural, and some even way out to the very far reaches of Yakutsk SSR, which was past the Ural Mountains, deep in Siberia. And so was my Aunt Bella, Uncle Moshe, and their two boys, Abraham and Chaim. They were all shipped by cattle cars for more than a week to Aldan, Yakutsk SSR. When a truck with two soldiers drove up to pick us up, my father showed the passport with paragraph 11, including the komandierówka as a buyer for a factory. They just simply saluted and walked away, left. And so we remained in Lwów, and Aunt Bella, her husband and children were shipped off to Aldan, Yakutsk SSR. My mother was naturally very distressed about the well-being of her sister and family, but after receiving a postcard with Aunt Bella and family's new address, she calmed down a lot and now had a new worry, being my Bar Mitzvah, which was under the communist rules. There was no such thing as religion, and therefore any religious function had to be well concealed and kept quiet. There was no functions in any of the synagogues, and the one that was nearest to us was about 2 blocks away, and it was shut down. However, within the courtyard of the synagogue lived the man who used to be Gabbai in that synagogue, and he lived in a little house in which he had hidden a Sefer Torah, and on occasions he would have let in to his house a minyan of men in order to perform a Bar Mitzvah. So my father organized a minyan, and in a very quiet way, one by one, snuck into the house. I made my brachas in a hurry, and shortly after my brachas, the sefer was closed and put away by that gabbai, and one by one we left the house quietly, and that was the extent of it. And I never owned talis or tefillin till after the war. And now my poor mother, having to care for her own family, had an additional obligation or even duty to make up packages with non-perishable food that she would pack in what was known as sugar bags. Those are cotton or linen woven bags, sacks. In those days, sugar and flour was delivered in large bags to groceries, and my mother used to be able to find a few of those bags and make a package. I think 20 kilo was the limit that you could send by mail, and she would drag one of those onto the streetcar and then off the streetcar to a post office, which was the only one that would take anything that went to Russia. So it was quite a job, but she did it often enough so that the children in Siberia and her sister and husband would have some help with food. In later years, after the war, my Aunt Bella brought with her one of those empty sugar bags, which my wife eventually sewed in as a commemoration of those packages into what is now my talus bag. So now my mother undertook to find out what her other 2 sisters are doing and the families. Since there was no mail between what was occupied by the Russians and the other half of Poland that was occupied by the Germans, even though it was Poland, there was a border and there was no communications, no mail or anything like that between the 2 halves of Poland. And so my mother has found that if we get to the other side, we may be able to travel to Krakow, where the rest of the family or her 2 sisters were with the families. And so we packed up a small bag, and since my mother wouldn't go without me, I came along, and Father stayed in Lwow. We got to the region where the border was. It was near Rawaruska, that is what now is known as the Ukraine, but it used to be Poland. And by knowing a few people in that village, because that's the region where my mother came from, Nemyriv and Lutowiska, it's all within a few kilometers. She was able to get someone that was known to smuggle people across the border. There was a small creek in a field, and that was more or less the border. There was another 2 or 3 other people that were in that group that wanted to cross, and we all crossed that creek. And no sooner we were on the other side, it almost looked like they were waiting for us. There was 1 German and 4 or 5 Polish police and some farmers. Like I said before, it looked like they were expecting us. Or maybe there was communication between our smuggler and the other side. In any event, once we crossed there, the Polish police said, "Where are we going?" And my mother said, "We're going back home." And the other people, whom I don't know, had some other excuse. Now everything was more or less to their liking. We're coming back home. But in one instance, one of the farmers pointed at me. I had a coat with a fur collar on it, and said, "How come he's got such a good coat? My boy could use it." And the Polish policeman turned around to the German, and after a minute or so, the German came over and said, "Take off the coat." I took off the coat, and this Polish farmer grabbed it and ran. But from that point on, we were more or less free. We went into a small place, and we got that whole group, mother, myself, and 3 other people, got a horse and buggy for a fee, naturally, to a town, I think it was called Zamość, because that's where the nearest railroad station was. We were also told by the local Jewish people that we better wear armbands with a Magen David, because otherwise if we get caught without it, there is already in Lublin the law that all Jews must wear it. And so we were intending to go to Lublin. That was the nearest junction to take a train to Krakow. And that's where we really wanted to go. So we did put armbands on and boarded a train to Lublin. I think it was a couple of hours. We wound up in Lublin station, where we were expecting to take a train to Krakow. After arriving there, we were walking towards the terminal in order to obtain tickets to get the next train to Krakow. And as we were walking, suddenly we ran into a group of people with armbands like ours, but they were on the side near the wall of a building, and 2 Germans who noticed us walking pushed us over to that group and lined up against the wall and waiting like in a lineup to buy or get something. We weren't aware why, but they were all lined up. So we stood in line just like the rest of them. There may have been maybe 15 or 20 people ahead of us, and our group created another 4 or 5 people. So we stood there for a few minutes, and suddenly, from an entrance that led down to a lower level, out came two Germans with white coats, like doctors, and those coats were sprinkled with blood all over, and they counted 4 or 6 more people from the lineup and took him down that basement entrance. And my mother went into a panic, worrying to death that what they're doing is they're killing us down in there. But there was no way out because there was 2 Germans watching our lineup, and we would have to remain with the rest of the group against the wall. So that repeated itself twice. The Germans came out again and took another 2 or 4 people down to the basement. All of a sudden, the 2 of them came out without the coats and said something to the 2 Germans that were watching over us, and they simply told us, "Get lost, dismissed." We later on found out, after staying overnight in the Jewish quarter of Lublin, we found out that all there was is they had some chickens to be defeathered, and they just simply took slaves to do the job by simply finding Jews. That incident and other stories my mother found out about the danger going from Lublin to Krakow. My mother made a decision that regardless of anything, she would like me to get back to Lwów to safety, and decided to return possibly the same way as we came, but not anymore by train, because my mother was very fearful about the exposure with the armband on the train, and there was a artificial transportation system, again by horse and buggy, that the Jews used between one locality and another. And my mother found a way to get onto one of those wagons that was going back towards Zamość and eventually towards the border. So we were traveling on one of those horse and buggies a whole day, because it was much slower than a train would be. And towards the evening, the man who drove the horse and buggy suggested we all scoot down because he saw something that he was fearful of. And as we passed that little village, we saw smoke coming out of a building, and what I thought was screams, which later was verified that it was the village synagogue that was on fire. And the screams, although I couldn't see it, probably came from people within that synagogue that was burned. And so eventually we have returned through the border back to Lwów, to Father and the apartment that we occupied. Shortly after our return, the war between the Germans and the Russians began, and it was only a couple of days till the Germans chased the Russians out of Lwów, and now we were part and parcel of the occupied Poland by the Germans, who just kept marching east through Ukraine onto Russia. the Germans being very efficient, after taking over Lwow, and maybe a couple of months later, made regulations that seem to be almost the same as we saw in Lublin. The Jews have to wear bands, and furthermore, they cannot live in certain areas. It all indicated to us that there will be a concentration of the Jewish population downtown, and where we used to go down to buy things in the markets, Jewish markets, and our Ukrainian landlord indicated that with those new regulations we would have to find a different place to live in. So my parents went down to what was known as the center of the Jewish population. It was called, the main street was called Słoneczna. That means the Sun Street. After a day or two, my parents found a dingy little room in back of a apartment building. This room being very small, just enough to have a couple of beds in there. We were forced to leave at our original apartment on Lutowiska, which was now a restricted area. We left most of the furnishings that we gathered during the Russian or Soviet Union occupation of Lwow. We had to now live just with the two beds that we were able to bring down to Słoneczna. And the rumor got around within a few days that there will be a ghetto, an enclosure where Słoneczna was included. But now my mother said there's no reason to stay here, since it's now one occupied country. Maybe we'll find ways to get back to Krakow, where we have, or she hoped we would have better accommodations. And so after search, she came up for money, and I understand there was a substantial amount of money, that one of the German trucks that done transportation between Lwow and Krakow would take us in the back of a truck back to Krakow. I don't really know how much, but I understand from the conversation I heard between my parents that while it was a lot of money, it's the only way to get back to maybe more comfortable surroundings, and the fact that we would unite with a family. So sure enough, one evening a truck drove up, and with two little suitcases and one pillow for me to lie down on, we were in the back of a truck headed for Krakow. I slept a few hours, but I was woken up by my mother telling me we have to get off the truck, because before Krakow there will be checkpoint of the Germans checking any vehicle that goes into the city of Krakow. And because of that, there'll be a problem when they discover Jews in back. So the driver, with the suggestion of my mother to drop us off in Wieliczka, which was some 20 kilometers east of Krakow, and that would take away any responsibility they would have, but at the same time they would have to deviate from the route maybe 5 kilometers to drop us off at an address that my mother had, which was my mother's cousin's son. His name was Moshe Schechter. And so we wound up in Velichka at about 4 in the morning, knocking on the door of Moshe Schechter, who was very, very happy to see us and to receive us in. A day or two later, I was told that the family that we were going to go to Krakow has taken refuge in a small town north of Krakow